Good day, everyone. So we're reviewing Wetzel's Limnology textbook. This is edition number 4. We're on chapter 15, the phosphorus cycle, and right now we're looking at phosphorus distribution in sediments. Phosphorus released from the sediments. Because of the obvious importance of phosphorus as a nutrient that often accelerates the productivity of freshwaters, much interest has been devoted to the phosphorus content of sediments and its movement into the overlying water. Lake sediments contain much higher concentrations of phosphorus than the overlying water and represent a large portion pool for phytoplankton under certain conditions. Under anaerobic conditions, the exchange equilibria are largely Under aerobic conditions, the exchange equilibria are largely unidirectional toward the sediments, although low release rates from aerobic sediments into overlying waters can occur. Under anaerobic conditions, however, inorganic exchange at the sediment-water interface is strongly influenced by redox conditions, unless aluminum-iron ratios are high. When these ratios are high, phosphorus is absorbed primarily to aluminum hydroxides, which are redox insensitive and do not release phosphorus under low redox potential. The depth of the sediments involved in the active migration of phosphorus to the water is considerable. In undisturbed anoxic sediments, given sufficient time, 2 to 3 months, phosphorus moved upward readily from a depth of at least 10 centimeters below the sediment surface to the overlying waters, regardless of whether the sediments were calcareous or eutrophic muds or acidic and peaty in nature. Comparison of movement in sterile sediments and sediments with anaerobic bacteria showed no significant difference, thus diffusion predominated. Phosphorus mobilizing bacteria, especially of the genera Pseudomonas bacterium and Chromobacterium, were abundant to at least 15 centimeter depth in reservoir sediments. Their abundance and vertical distribution varied with the type of sediments. Low numbers occurred in sandy sediments with small amount of silt, and the bacteria were concentrated near the interface. Their numbers increased more uniformly with depth in sandy sediments with moderate amounts of organic matter and silts. The greatest numbers of bacteria were found in silts high in organic matter. These authors examined the relationship of bacterial densities and the organic content of sediments in detail and found only a weak correlation in a large number of lakes. Bacterial numbers in the sediments increased proportionally, especially at the interface, with several indices of increasing lake productivity in lakes of neutral or alkaline pH and with low concentration of humic compounds. In general, however, bacterial production rates are correlated with phosphorus and carbon in the sediments. Bacterial biomass in sediments of organically stained acidic bog lakes was also high. Although bacteria are a major importance in the dynamics of phosphorus cycling in the water, as will be discussed in the following section, their role in the expediting phosphorus exchange across the sediment interface is relatively minor in comparison to chemical equilibria processes. Bacterial composition is proportional to bacterial densities at the interface and directly related to the general productivity of the lake, because their metabolic activity is driven largely by the supply rate of organic matter. The sediment microflora is important in increasing the concentrations of phosphorus dissolved in the interstitial water of the sediment. Bacterial metabolism at the interface, however, has relatively little effect on biogenic fixation and removal of phosphate from the overlying water. In sterilized and natural sediments, microbial fixation and transport of phosphorus from the water to the sediments amounted to less than 5% of the total movement under anaerobic reducing conditions. Under aerobic conditions, bacteria of the interface did significantly increase the microbial transport of phosphorus to the sediments, and this loss was related to the amount of microbial phosphorus sedimenting to the interface. Mobilization of sediment-associated phosphorus to the overlying water has been described largely to phosphate release from ferrous oxide, as these compounds are reduced by anaerobic conditions in surface sediments and the overlying water, a process referred to as reductive dissolution. Mobilization can, however, occur in a variety of other ways that do not involve ferric oxide, such as desorption of organic and inorganic phosphorus bound to mineral surfaces, dissolution of minerals including phosphate within their crystal structure, mineralization of organic matter, excretion of phosphate by macrophyte roots and bacteria, and dissociation of ternary phosphorus complexes with humics. While phosphate release rates are undoubtedly higher in many lakes under anaerobic conditions, such conditions alone may not lead to higher internal phosphorus loading. For example, high amount of aluminum hydroxide to iron hydroxide in sediments may limit phosphate release under anaerobic conditions. When the release of phosphate is compared on a molar ratio to phosphate liberated per unit of organic carbon mineralized by bacterial metabolism, the availability of alternate electron acceptor compounds such as sulfate becomes as important within the interstitial waters of the sediments as the oxidative conditions of the overlying water. Phosphate release from sediments can increase as sulfate concentration increase from natural or anthropogenic sources. However, the potential for higher internal loading in acidified oligotrophic softwater lakes is more than offset by lower external phosphorus inputs, possibly from increased phosphorus retention by acidified soils. Conversely, decline in sulfate deposition could result in lower internal loading. Iron sulfide formation coupled with sulfate reduction can reduce the abundance of iron compounds that can complex phosphate and thereby promote release of phosphate into the sediment pore water. When sulfate content is low or absent in anaerobic sediment, microbial reduction generates ferrous compounds from the microbial reduction of ferric oxide. Phosphate can be retained effectively with ferrous compounds, vivianite, but iron-associated phosphate is quantitatively released when amorphous ferric oxide of the sediment is converted to iron sulfides. Conversion of reactive sediment iron compounds to iron sulfide by sulfate reducing bacteria leads to a more efficient release of iron associated phosphate that does direct microbial ferric oxide reduction. Other processes can contribute to the composite release of iron-associated phosphate from sediments. For example, the uptake of excessive amounts of phosphorus by aerobic bacteria and storage as polyphosphates could be rapidly degraded and released with the onset of anaerobic conditions. As organic sediments are aerobic for only up to several millimeters, this contribution is likely small in comparison to other mechanisms. The absorption capacities of ferric oxide decrease as pH levels increase above 6.5. Large increases in pH values can occur within the sediments for several millimeters as a result of diurnal fluctuation in photosynthesis by epiphytic algae and by submerged aquatic macrophytes and associated epiphytic algae. Simultaneous increases in oxygen concentration and absorption to or with photosynthetically induced precipitation of calcium carbonate can counteract the availability of desorbed phosphate. Before we move on, let's look at these figures here. Figure 15-7, interaction of sulfate on the reduction of ferric and release of ferrous, iron, and phosphate. SRB is sulfate reducing bacteria. FERB is iron reducing bacteria. So we have sulfate reducing bacteria that is acting upon the sulfate here, and that is providing an electron, and that is then combined with hydrogen sulfide and with ferric hydroxide phosphate complex, and then so we have oxygen here, and then we have indirect reduction into ferrous iron, and combining with phosphate here as well, and that ends up with this ferrous hydroxide phosphate complex. And then we have another one that is a direct reduction instead of indirect here, where we have iron, as always, this ferric hydroxide phosphate group, and with the action of iron reducing bacteria, and we end up with the same product that we did here on the indirect reduction curve. And then all of this is generating this ferrous hydroxide phosphate complex, or ferric hydroxide, ferric phosphates here, mineral precipitate, and then this is a surface complex. Okay, so this is figure 15-8, distribution of pH. Left, elimination of 30 macromoles of quanta per meter square per second, and dissolved oxygen is on the right, immediately above and within sediments colonized by epipelic macroalgae, and epipelic macroalgae are algae that grow on hard surfaces such as rocks, and bacterial communities. Oxygen macro profiles on the right during darkness, open circle, and after 1 hour, the squares, and 8 hours, the black rectangle, and then 10 hours, the circles, the black circles. Now on the left, we have the distribution of the pH here. So on the right we have oxygen, and on the left we have pH. And on the y-axis we have the millimeters from the interface of the water sediment interface, and then on the x-axis we either have pH or we have oxygen in macromoles per liter. So if we looked at pH first, so the pH during the darkness, after 6 hours of darkness, like increases up to the point where it reaches the interface, and then the sediment water interface, that is, and then it remains constant. For a light regime, we have kind of an inverse behavior. We have pH getting really, like, actually close to alkaline conditions here, basic, like up to 9, close to the sediment water interface, and then becoming like decreasing again after that, and to have a value that is about the mirror value of the one where we have like a regime of darkness. And on the right we have so we have like the concentration of oxygen decreasing as we are switching into like a presence of light version. So for example, during the darkness open circles we have pretty high oxygen, then after 1 hour we have the same kind of pattern than we did after 6 hours of darkness, but not as pronounced. And then we have those two curves here that it doesn't really give us a lot of data above the interface, but what we can glean from that is that the concentration of oxygen is actually higher than it is for these values during the darkness. So the rates of phosphorus release from lake sediments increase about doubles markedly if the sediments are disturbed by agitation from turbulence. Covering anaerobic sediments with sand or polyethylene sheeting greatly impedes the loss of oxygen from the overlying water and decreases sediments' release of phosphorus, iron, and ammonium. In thermally stratified lakes, the internal phosphorus loading rates, expressed as mass of phosphorus per lake per day, increases with time as the hypolimnetic anoxic area increases, which generally happens during the thermally stratified season. It is thus a function of the areal and temporal extent of sediment anoxia. The latter can be summarized in terms of an annual parameter, the anoxic factor, defined as the duration of anoxia multiplied by anoxic sediment area, lake area. Empirical relationships between the AF, or anoxic factor, and annual internal loading rates have been developed. Most studies of internal loading have focused on hypolimnia in thermally stratified lakes, where oxygen depletion is easily detected with relatively large oxygen sensors. However, internal loading has also been detected in shallow waters of eutrophic, thermally stratified, and polymictic lakes, where anoxic layers are thinner and episodic, thus requiring different sensors. In thermally stratified lakes, internally loaded phosphorus becomes photosynthetically available as anoxic hypolimnetic water is entrained into metalimnetic waters over the summer and after turnover, while internally loaded phosphorus in shallow waters is entrained into the mixed layer when wind speed increases. Hypoxic bottom water can also be translocated during episodic coastal upwelling events from hypoxic hypolimnia to shallower waters in large lakes, for example in Lake Erie. It follows that translocated hypoxic waters can increase phosphorus concentration in shallower waters if they are phosphorus enriched. Algae and cyanobacteria growing on sediments are able to effectively utilize phosphorus from the sediments. Moreover, phytoplankton suspended in water with various particulate inorganic compounds of extremely low solubility were capable of extracting sufficient phosphorus for growth. Without sediment phosphorus sources, the phosphorus content of the water-limited phytoplankton growth under experimental conditions. The presence or absence of bacteria had little effect on the algal utilization of phosphorus. These results stress the importance of extractable phosphates in the sediment if they are agitated into the water column, as in shallow lakes, even though their solubilities may be extremely low. Some phosphorus release occurs from littoral sediments under aerobic conditions, particularly as temperature warms above 10 to 15 degrees centigrade. However, fluxes are limited compared to anaerobic release rates. Release rates under aerobic conditions increase as phosphate concentration in the overlying water decline below equilibrium levels and as pH increases from the intense photosynthetic activity of submerged macrophytes and attached algae. Because the volume of the littoral water is often small in comparison to that of the total lake, the littoral water often cools more rapidly at night than the pelagic zone. Convective flows from the littoral as interflow to the base of the epilimnion can move appreciable quantities of phosphorus from the littoral areas to the pelagic zone, especially if the littoral zone is large relative to the pelagic zone. And that will be it for today, and tomorrow we'll pick it up with this subchapter D, benthic algae and phosphorus release from sediment. Thank you and have a good day. Bye.